would never truly stop speaking. Not in voices, not in dreams, but in a language far older, carved into the very marrow of our existence. Their words are brittle now, yellowed with age, hollowed by time. Yet they linger in crypts, in forgotten tombs, in the dust of burial grounds, where silence feels alive. To us, bones may look like remains, but to those who came before, they were revelations. Each fracture, each scar, each line burned or carved into the bone was a whisper from the beyond. Entire civilizations were built on these whispers. Rituals were born. Wars were waged. Lives were ended. All because of the language of bones. And the question we must ask is chilling. The story begins in ancient China, more than 3,000 years ago. Picture it, a kingdom ruled not only by emperors, but by spirits. Beneath the flicker of torchlight, a priest kneels before an animal bone, its surface smooth and pale. He places it carefully over glowing embers. The fire spits. Cracks spider across the surface, sharp and sudden. The priest leans close, his breath caught, his lips moving silently. For him, these cracks are not random. They are answers, messages, a direct line to ancestors who have already crossed into death. These were called oracle bones, pieces of ox scapula or turtle shell, scorched until they cracked. And here's the haunting part. Many of the answers recorded on these bones aligned eerily with what actually unfolded. Victories predicted, famines warned, disasters foreseen. Skeptics might call it coincidence, but the Shang dynasty did not. To them, the bones were not silent. They spoke, and what they said shaped the fate of millions. Now, imagine the weight of that ritual. The firelight quivering, the hiss of bone under heat, the silence of the gathered court holding its breath, waiting for cracks to reveal their truth. Can you hear it? The faint pop of marrow, the priest whispering, "Yes, the spirits approve." Even now, thousands of years later, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of these oracle bones, many etched with carved inscriptions, questions asked by rulers who have long since turned to dust. And yet, but not all bones were honored. Some were feared. Across Europe, scattered burial sites tell a different story. Graves unearthed with skeletons deliberately disturbed, their bones etched with strange carvings, their joints shattered or bound with iron. At first glance, scholars believed these were punishments for criminals even after death. But the patterns didn't align with justice. They aligned with ritual. Take, for example, a grave uncovered in Romania. Inside lay the body of a man, his ribcage shattered, his skull carefully split in two. Along the surface of the bone, faint spirals had been carved. Alone, they seemed meaningless. But when compared to other graves, the spirals formed a sequence, almost like a code. Some say it was meant to bind the spirit, trapping it from returning to haunt the living. Others suggest the opposite, that the carvings were a desperate attempt to send messages back to the world of the living. Local folklore still whispers about those fields. Workers at the excavation claimed the ground was unnaturally cold. At dusk, when the wind passed through the grass, some swore they heard voices carried in it. Not screams, not wails, but whispers. One archaeologist, years later, wrote in her journal, words never meant to be published. It wasn't the bones that unsettled me. It was the feeling that we weren't uncovering them. They were uncovering us. Bones, after all, were not always buried. Some were kept, revered, transformed into instruments of ritual. In parts of South America, bones became flutes. The femur of a fallen warrior was polished, hollowed, and carved until it sang. The sound produced was unlike any other, sharp, shrill, piercing in a way that clung to the air long after the note had ended. To the tribes who used them, these sounds were not music. They were voices, the spirit of the dead, returning to guide or to warn. Shamans would sit in circles, bone flutes at their lips, summoning sounds that echoed into the jungle. And here's where it gets even stranger. Some of these bone flutes survive today, locked in museum storage. And when researchers dared to test them, the recordings captured sounds that defied logic. Hollow, breathless tones that carried patterns eerily similar to human speech. Coincidence? Or were these flutes, carved centuries ago, truly carrying the voices of the dead? The deeper we look, the more the silence grows heavy. Oracle bones, carved graves, instruments of spirit. Each culture, separated by oceans and centuries, returned again and again to the same belief. Bones were never silent. And yet, that leaves us with a disturbing question. If bones can speak, then what are they saying? Are they guiding us, protecting us, or warning us? In the next part of our journey, we'll uncover the rituals of divination, the silent oracles, the ceremonies where bones were not only remnants, but conduits of prophecy, where futures were decided, empires directed, and destinies sealed by the brittle fragments of the dead. Every legend begins with a story, but some stories are written not in ink, but in trembling hands and sleepless nights. In the late 1800s, a European antiquarian known only as M. Kessler claimed to have uncovered a method of speaking with the departed through fragments of bone. His personal journal, found after his death, is scattered with unsettling entries. One page describes a ritual. He writes of placing small bones in a circle, each piece aligned with cardinal directions. He would sit in the center, waiting, listening. According to him, faint scratching noises echoed around the room. At first, he believed it was rodents. But then, the sounds began to form patterns. Taps, knocks, almost like coded messages. Another entry, dated November 3rd, reads, "The journal ends abruptly. His final words scrawled violently across the page. It is not me recording them. It is them recording me." Kessler's body was discovered weeks later, slunked in his study, his rib cage fractured inward. His bones had broken from within. To this day, no one can explain it. Bones do not always speak as whole fragments. Sometimes their whispers live in the dust. In the deserts of North Africa, nomadic tribes once carried small pouches filled with powdered bone. They claimed the dust had protective properties. Thrown into a fire, it produced strange colored flames. Sprinkled across a threshold, it was said to repel spirits. But one practice stood out: inhalation. Shamans would breathe in the fine dust of their ancestors during rituals. Witnesses described them trembling violently, their eyes rolling back, speaking in voices that were not their own. Entire villages would gather to hear the words of the ancestors spoken. A disturbing account from the 13th century describes one shaman who inhaled so much dust that his voice deepened into an unnatural growl. The crowd, terrified yet entranced, listened as he gave warnings of famine and plague. Within a year, both struck the region. Skeptics dismiss this as coincidence, but the ritual remains unnerving. What if in inhaling dust, they were not only connecting to memory, but giving the bones a second chance to breathe? Beneath the Czech Republic lies the Sedlec ossuary, better known as the Bone Church. Its walls are decorated with the skeletons of more than 40,000 people. Skulls line arches, femurs build pyramids. Chandeliers drip with jawbones and ribs. To tourists, it is a macabre work of art. But to those who've lingered within its halls after closing, it is something else entirely. Several caretakers over the centuries have reported strange phenomena. Candles extinguish themselves in rooms without drafts. Skulls shift positions overnight. And most unsettling of all, voices. Not loud, not clear, but soft. A chorus of murmurs, like the faint rustling of dry leaves. One caretaker in the 1970s recorded an audio tape while locking up for the night. On playback, amidst the clatter of keys and footsteps, another sound emerged. A whisper, faint but undeniable. Stay. Experts have dismissed the recording as static interference, but those who visit the ossuary often remark on the same sensation. an overwhelming urge to remain, as if the thousands of bones long for company, for someone to continue listening. Science, too, has begun to uncover strange truths. Recent studies in osteoarchaeology revealed that ancient bones sometimes contain markings invisible to the naked eye. Under ultraviolet light, faint grooves and symbols appear, patterns carved not by natural decay, but by human hands. One discovery in France involved the skeleton of a woman buried nearly 2,000 years ago. Her femur carried shallow etchings, spirals arranged in repeating sequences. Scholars analyzed the pattern and realized it mirrored a form of early proto-writing, a language long thought extinct. But here's the chilling part. The sequence didn't match her culture. It didn't belong to her people. Instead, it resembled symbols from a civilization hundreds of miles away. So how did they appear on her bones? Was she taken? Was she sacrificed? Or had the bones themselves been used as a tablet, a vessel for words? It's an unsettling thought. Bones, not as remains, but as a form of parchment. A message written not to the living, but to the dead. We began this journey in ancient crypts. We've seen bones cracked for prophecy, carved for warning, hollowed for voices, ground into dust for breath. And still, the silence grows heavier. Because if bones are a language, then who are we to say we've translated it correctly? With every ritual, every fracture, every spiral we've uncovered has been only part of the sentence. And if that's true, what message still waits to be heard? In the next part of our journey, we'll explore the silent oracles, the rituals of divination, where bones weren't relics of death, but instruments of fate itself, where kings, shamans, and conquerors bent their knees not to gods, but to the whispers hidden in brittle remains. In 1921, during the renovation of an old manor in rural England, workers discovered something strange beneath the rotting floorboards of the dining hall. A shallow cavity, packed tightly with human bones. They were not laid out as skeletons. Instead, they had been deliberately arranged. Long bones aligned like spokes of a wheel, skulls stacked in a crude ring. At first, authorities assumed it was the work of grave robbers hiding their spoils. But upon closer inspection, deep in the forests of Poland, there is an abandoned village. Its last inhabitants left nearly 2 centuries ago. But the reason has never been written, only whispered. At the center of the ruins lies a well, sealed with heavy stones. Local legend calls it the Whispering Well. According to folklore, bones were dropped into the water as offerings. Villagers claimed that if you leaned close enough, you could hear answers to your questions, echoing up from the darkness below. But the answers were never in words. They came as whispers, rattles, even strange clicks, as though something deep inside the earth was speaking through the bones. A folklorist in the 19th century recorded his visit. He wrote, "The stones were slick, the air heavy. I leaned near, listening. At first, nothing. Then, a murmur, like breath over hollow reeds. I could not understand the words, but I understood the meaning. It did not want me there. I left, though I felt its eyes in the dark long after. The well remains sealed. Locals refuse to approach it after dusk. Some say the bones at its bottom still whisper, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen." Throughout history, fragments of bone inscriptions have appeared where they shouldn't. Symbols that don't belong. In 2009, archaeologists excavating a site in Turkey discovered a bone fragment carved with characters resembling cuneiform. But the fragment was thousands of miles from where cuneiform was ever written. Stranger still, the marks didn't match any known language. They were close, familiar, but off. When linguists attempted to decode them, they discovered repeating structures like grammar, a system, almost a language. But no translation could be found. One researcher grew obsessed. He spent months studying the marks, convinced they held meaning. His final notes contained a chilling line. "Bones are supposed to be still. That is their nature. Unmoving, silent, but sometimes they move." In the early 1900s, during an excavation in Egypt, a group of workers unearthed a tomb, filled not with treasure, but with bones stacked high to the ceiling. Each night, they piled what they had found outside the chamber, and each morning, the bones were back inside, arranged neatly, as though they had never been touched. At first, the workers accused one another of playing tricks, but after weeks of this, they refused to continue. The excavation was abandoned, the tomb resealed. Rumors say that if you press your ear against its stone door, you can hear the faint shifting of bone on bone, a sound that should not be. We've stepped into crypts, into wells, into houses where silence itself felt alive. We've listened to whispers etched into marrow, warnings carved into skulls, voices pressed into dust. And yet, everything we've seen so far is only the threshold. These are not the answers, only the beginnings of questions. Because if bones truly speak, then the rituals built around them were not mere superstition. They were attempts at translation. But translation of what? In the next part of our journey, we will open the gate of prophecy. We will step into the chambers where bones were treated not as remains, but as oracles, where kings bent their will to the brittle voices of the dead, where the silent language of bones didn't just whisper, it ruled. So listen closely tonight. Picture a darkened hall lit only by flickering torches. The air smells of smoke and something far more unsettling, burnt marrow. A priest kneels before the fire, holding a polished fragment of ox scapula. He lowers it into the flames, his eyes unblinking as the bone begins to hiss. Cracks split across its surface. Not random, not meaningless. To him, these are words, answers, the language of the ancestors, pressed into silence until the fire forces it free. The records still exist. Thousands of oracle bones, carved with inscriptions that survive to this day. Each one a question etched by trembling hands, desperate for answers from the dead. Some questions were mundane. Will the harvest be good this year? Others were chilling. Will the king die in battle? But the disturbing part is this. Many of the answers seemed to come true. When a bone declared that rain would fall, the skies often opened. When it warned of rebellion, the enemy appeared at the gates. Was it coincidence? Careful manipulation by priests? Or something else? Something darker? Something listening? Archaeologists studying these bones have noticed a strange pattern. The fractures aren't always random. A legend from the Shang dynasty tells of one night when the bones gave an answer no one expected. The king, desperate for guidance, asked if he would live through the winter. The bone was placed in fire, and the cracks spread violently across its surface, more than anyone had ever seen before. Priests gasped. The sound was said to be like thunder. When they interpreted the message, the answer was clear. No. That winter, the king did not die. But every priest who stood in that hall, every man who listened to the bones cracking that night, within 3 months, they were gone. Illness, accidents, sudden, violent deaths. The king survived, but the ones who spoke for the bones did not. Even centuries later, that oracle bone was found. It lies now in a museum. Its surface still scorched. Its cracks spread like veins. Visitors have reported feeling faint when standing near it. Some claim to hear faint popping sounds, like marrow breaking in flame. It is said that even now, the bone still carries its answer. Not for the king, but for anyone who dares to ask. It wasn't only fire. Some cultures believed that bones could reveal fate when cast upon the ground. The Scythians, nomads of the Eurasian steppes, carried with them polished knuckle bones, small enough to fit in the palm. These bones were thrown like dice, and their patterns read as prophecy. But unlike dice, they were not games. Each throw was a question. Should we travel? Should we raid? Should we trust the stranger at our fire? Over time, certain bones were said to grow attuned. The more they were used, the more accurate they became. Warriors feared them. Shamans worshipped them. And there were whispers. Sometimes the bones didn't wait to be cast. Sometimes they shifted on their own. One story tells of a night when a set of knuckle bones, untouched, rolled across the floor of a chieftain's tent. They spelled a pattern no one wanted to read. By dawn, the camp was attacked, slaughtered in their sleep. And when survivors returned to the ruins, the bones were still there, sitting in the ashes, arranged in the same chilling pattern. Bones burned, bones cast, bones carved with desperate questions. All of it points to one thing: the dead were never silent. They were asked to guide the living. And if the stories are true, they answered. But what if the answers were never guidance at all? What if they were warnings we failed to understand? The rituals of prophecy may seem like echoes of superstition, but the questions remain carved in history. The cracks still exist. The dice still remain. The whispers, faint but insistent, still call from the marrow of time. And if bones can predict the future, then the next question is chilling. Are they still doing it now? In the next chapter of our journey, we leave prophecy behind and step into the realm of guardianship, where bones were not used to predict, but to protect, where the dead were transformed into shields, amulets, and monuments. But beware. Across countless cultures, fragments of bone were carried close to the body, not as macabre trophies, but as sacred guardians. A sliver of rib worn on a leather cord, a shard of skull set in bronze, tiny finger bones carved smooth by touch, passed from parent to child like a secret inheritance. These amulets were not decorations. They were barriers, shields against evil, silent companions to guard the living from forces they could not see. In the Carpathian Mountains, villagers once whispered of white charms, small bones worn near the heart. Those who carried them claimed to walk untouched through plagues, storms, and even wars. Their neighbors swore the bones glowed faintly on moonless nights, as if the marrow still remembered life. In parts of medieval Europe, it was common to bury the bones of loved ones beneath the threshold of a home. Not in a graveyard, not in a shrine, but directly beneath the floorboards. The belief was simple. As long as the bones remained near, the spirit would guard the household. Children would grow under the silent gaze of their ancestors. Crops would thrive. Fires would not spread. But there were darker stories too. A traveler in the 15th century recorded visiting a cottage where the family warned him never to sit near the hearth at night. When asked why, they whispered that the floor shifted sometimes. That faint scratching came from beneath the planks. The traveler didn't believe them until midnight, when the sound began. Scraping, dragging, the unmistakable movement of something that was supposed to be still. The next morning, the family admitted the truth. A great-grandfather's bones lay beneath that very spot, and sometimes he still moved to remind them that he was watching. Few places reveal humanity's obsession with bone guardianship more vividly than the ossuaries of Europe. The most famous, the Sedlec ossuary in the Czech Republic, holds the remains of over 40,000 souls. Not hidden, but displayed. Skulls stacked into pyramids, femurs forming chandeliers, ribs woven into garlands that drape the walls like grotesque lace. Tourists call it haunting. Locals call it holy. But for centuries, the belief was clear. Bones, arranged with reverence, could sanctify a space. They could protect a church, bless its visitors, and remind all who entered that death was not the end, but a presence woven into every prayer. And yet some who visit describe the same feeling. Bones were not only shields for the living, they were guides for the dead. In ancient Greece, it was believed that placing fragments of bone or ivory tokens in a grave helped the spirit navigate the treacherous journey to the underworld. Without them, the path was perilous. With them, the way was lit. Similar practices appeared in South America, Africa, and Asia. Bones carved into shapes, laid gently across the chest of the deceased, like keys. But why bones? Perhaps because flesh rots, words fade, but bones endure. They were seen as eternal, a language the underworld could always recognize. A silent passport, stamped with the essence of the person who once lived. And sometimes, the living kept one token back, a finger bone, a tooth, something small, hidden in a pouch. The idea was simple. If the dead ever lost their way, the family still held a piece of them, a beacon to call them home. But keeping such a fragment came with whispers. Families who held them too long reported strange dreams, heavy footsteps in the house, a sense that the missing piece wanted desperately to be whole again. Protection, passage, memory. The guardianship of bones was never only about keeping evil out. It was about keeping connection alive between the living and the dead, between the seen and unseen. Every amulet worn, every skull displayed, every fragment buried beneath a floorboard spoke the same truth. The dead were never gone. They lingered, not as shadows, but as sentinels. But here is the unsettling thought. If bones could protect, could they also imprison? Some archaeologists believe certain bone arrangements weren't for guidance or safety at all. They were locks. Rituals meant not to free spirits, but to keep them bound. And if that's true, then breaking those arrangements, digging, disturbing, moving what should never have been moved, might not simply silence history, it might release it. As we step into our next chapter, the story grows darker still. For if bones could shield and guide, they could also control. They could curse. They could command. and the rituals that followed were not meant to protect the living. They were meant to dominate them. Bones were not always tools of protection or prophecy. In some cultures, they were weapons. Deep in the forests of West Africa, shamans performed rites using the bones of enemies. A finger here, a rib there, carefully preserved, charged with intent. The goal was simple: control. Spirits bound, actions directed, lives manipulated. One account from the 18th century tells of a chieftain who believed he could bend an enemy's will by placing the bones of a fallen warrior under his bed. Within days, the man's rival became obedient to every command, until he fell ill mysteriously and died. Similar stories echo across time and continents. Music, too, became a form of communication with spirits. In ancient Siberia, shamans carved bone into whistles and small drums. Each note, each rhythm, was believed to carry messages between realms. During ceremonies, the sounds were said to summon spirits, to guide hunters, protect villages, or even strike fear into enemies. Some instruments, however, were thought to have wills of their own. Played improperly, they could summon entities that lingered long after the ritual ended. There is one recorded incident where a shaman's bone flute, played in isolation, emitted a sound resembling human speech. It whispered secrets of the forest, naming the names of the living. The shaman reportedly fled, never to return. Sometimes, bones were displayed as warnings. In medieval Europe, criminal skeletons were mounted in city gates or buried upright in crossroads. The message was unmistakable: cross the boundary, and death will speak. Archaeologists in the UK have found skeletons with unusual arrangements: ribs twisted, hands bound, skulls etched with symbols. These weren't graves, they were signs. Silent threats, messages carved into bone that conveyed both power and terror. Visitors to such sites often reported unease, even in modern times. Some claimed the skeletons seemed to follow them with their eyes. Others felt an invisible weight pressing down on their shoulders. Throughout history, cultures that mastered the language of bones held a terrifying advantage, not just over enemies, but over communities, families, and even their own kind. The rituals of domination were subtle, yet absolute. A single misaligned bone could undo a curse, but a correctly placed fragment could bind generations. In one chilling account, a king in Southeast Asia used bones to maintain loyalty. Those who disobeyed were said to hear the cracking of bones beneath their beds at night, a warning of inevitable consequences. Many fled, some went mad, and a few died under mysterious circumstances. Even now, archaeologists uncover the remnants of such arrangements: bones placed unnaturally, symbols carved with intent, and some believe that these sites retain residual energy, a whispering of control. And so we reach the final chapter of our journey. Bones as prophecy, bones as protection, bones as power. Through all the centuries, through all the rituals, one truth becomes undeniable. The dead have never been silent, but their words are not always guidance. They can be warning, they can be commands, they can be subtle, persistent influences, shaping the living in ways we do not fully understand. Even today, when archaeologists uncover ancient sites, when shamans perform rituals, when music echoes through carved flutes, the language of bones speaks. The final question remains: if the dead could speak through their bones, what would they say to us now?